All right. Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster. I currently serve as the editor of the Online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which is based in the Bobby L. Roberts Library for Arkansas History and Art here in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Roberts Library is located in downtown Little Rock, across from the main library on Rock Street, and it houses, aside from the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, the galleries at Library Square and the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. During the pandemic, the Central Arkansas Library System branches are offering curbside service for patrons to pick up their library materials. And you can use our Ask a Librarian, Ask a Genealogist service to get your research questions answered via phone or email. Starting today, June 8th, several branches are allowing a limited number of patrons into their buildings by appointment to use computers, to fax items, and do other services. For more details about these services, go to cals.org. That is CALS.org. And of course, we're doing a lot of virtual programming while we are closed. These include story times, cooking classes, craft activities, fun podcasts. You can find most of these programs archived on CAL's YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com and search for the Central Arkansas Library System. Subscribe to the channel to get notification when the latest videos are posted, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with interesting, fun, and educational content. One of the things we're doing at the Roberts Library, and this relates to this lecture series, in fact, is collecting your stories, photos, and art relating to the COVID-19 pandemic experiences of Arkansans. We did a similar collecting initiative last year during the famous Arkansas River flood. Please go to robertslibrary.org for more information or to submit your photographs and stories. We want to hear from you. Your story is important to Arkansas history. Now to this evening's program titled, "It is About as Bad as War, Pandemics and the Spread of Disease in Arkansas" by Tim Nutt. Tim is an old friend of mine. He is currently the director of the Historical Research Center at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Previously, he was head of special collections at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville and was founding deputy curator of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies at the Central Arkansas Library System. He also served as the founding manager, editor, and staff historian of the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. A native of Bigelow, Arkansas, Tim received his BA in history from the University of Central Arkansas and a master's in library science with an emphasis on archives from the University of Oklahoma. He is a past president of the Arkansas Historical Association and a certified archivist. If you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat on Zoom anytime during the talk, and we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This is also being broadcast on YouTube, but please don't leave any questions there. Try to leave them on the Zoom chat. And with all that said, I shall now turn this over to Tim Nutt.
Thank you, Guy. Excuse me. I am glad to be here tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and start my share my screen. Let's see. Okay. I am having trouble sharing my screen. There we go. You'd think after all this time, all these presentations I've done, I would be able to do this by now. Okay. Tonight we're going to, I appreciate being here. First off, thank you all for coming or staying in on this rainy night. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about pandemics and disease and just all sorts of feel-good things related to disease. As Guy mentioned, I am currently the director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS. We are the archives department of the medical school. We're housed in the UAMS library, and we have a mission to preserve not only the history of UAMS, but also the history of health sciences in Arkansas. And that runs the gamut the health sciences: doctors, nurses, massage therapists, dentists, and diseases and pandemics. We try to collect everything dealing with that. And right now, we are the only archives in the state dedicated to the health sciences. So whereas Butler Center collects all of Arkansas history, U of A Fayetteville collects all of Arkansas history, the Historical Research Center focuses exclusively on the health sciences. So tonight I'm pleased to be here, pleased to kick off this Monday Maladies series with the CALS Encyclopedia of Arkansas with the Roberts Library. As Guy mentioned, I have a long history with the Central Arkansas Library System, so I'm pleased to help them and be here tonight. Future presentations in this series are going to focus on specific events. You're going to have one future presentation on the flu pandemic of 1918. So I'm just going to touch on briefly those events, and then you'll get, if you sign up for the other events later on, you'll get more information about those. And so tonight we're just going to be discussing general pandemics, disease, these things that have afflicted Arkansas, and how the spread of diseases have affected Arkansans through the years. So let's get started right now. The United States has been hit by diseases throughout its history. Of course, we all know that. Even before the creation of what we now know as the United States, European settlers brought smallpox to North America, ravaging the Native American population. Periodic outbreaks of the mosquito-borne disease yellow fever and cholera, which is caused by unsanitary conditions, have affected different parts of the country over the years. These epidemics, and I have a selected list on your screen right now, they've killed thousands of people throughout the year. You'll notice the first one that I've listed, 1793, yellow fever epidemic, killed approximately 4,000 people in Philadelphia. You'll notice that yellow fever shows up in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1878 yellow fever epidemic that hit the southern US. Of course, polio, and moving into more recent times, AIDS in the 80s, 90s, and continuing today, around 700,000 deaths in the US. And then this year, COVID-19, which nationwide has killed over 100,000 people. So as science and our knowledge of diseases have advanced, so too has the ability to decrease the frequency of these diseases that you see on the screen that have plagued humans throughout our history. But while vaccines have conquered some, there's always a new disease to be confronted, as we know with the rise of COVID-19. So with our collective experiences today, I think we can all better understand how we can better empathize with our ancestors and how they confronted the diseases that affected them, the Spanish flu in 1918, for example, or more recently, as I mentioned, the AIDS pandemic. So by now, I mean, you probably have heard of the 1918, what they call the Spanish flu. It's hard not to have heard of the flu epidemic of 1918, simply because of its magnitude and because you have a lot of comparisons being drawn between the 1918 flu and what we're going through now with COVID-19. So the Spanish flu was named because it was first reported in Spain during World War I, although that's not where it originated. Affected 1918, 1919, those years. And there are a lot of similarities with that pandemic, with the flu, and what we're seeing now. So you'll hear people talk about how the flu came in 3 different waves, and how we're looking and perhaps assuming that the COVID-19 will have different waves. There's saying that there might be another wave in the fall. Wearing masks, that you'll see the illustration on your screen about people wearing masks to protect themselves and others from the disease, passing on the germs. and especially with the 1918 flu, how quickly someone became sick. The 1918 flu was a very fast-acting flu. They would say that you could come down with the first symptoms of having trouble breathing, and then 12 hours later you would basically drown because your lungs were so filled. So there's all these different comparisons that people use nowadays to compare COVID-19 and the 1918 flu. Now, there's no doubt that the 1918 flu was extremely deadly, and it left indelible emotional scars on people around the world. It was hard to find a family that was not affected by the 1918 flu. It affected nearly every household in the United States. It affected almost every country in the world. It touched on almost every continent. And it was not uncommon for multiple members of the same family to catch the flu at the same time, and to have multiple members of that family die either the same day or within hours or days of each other. So at the time, as World War I was winding down in 1918, of course, and as that was occurring, the health crisis became more apparent, and the countries started shifting to fight this new war, the flu of 1918. As I mentioned, it became known as the Spanish flu, and it ranks as one of the deadliest outbreaks in recorded history, having an estimated 50 million deaths. With there were about 700,000 deaths in the United States alone from that pandemic. The numbers are most likely low when it comes to estimating the number of deaths from the flu, because of poor record keeping. A lot of people weren't identified as dying from the flu, or the subsequent pneumonia that came from the flu. So you have the numbers, people saying that the numbers could go as high as 100 million of deaths from the flu. And so there's that big range, 50 million to 100 million, on how many people died from the 1918 flu. Now, why is that number so astronomical? Why is that number so high? The lack of medical care. The United States was a rural country, had a lot of people living in rural areas. The lack of medical care was especially prominent in African-American communities. So along the Mississippi Delta, you had a lot of people who did not have access to medical care, as in the cities or in urban areas. You had poor communication, information dispersal, how to prevent from getting the flu. All that information was hard to get out to the public. And so you had a lot of these factors that contributed to the staggering number of deaths from the flu. Now, as I mentioned, there's considered 3 different waves of the 1918 flu. There was the spring and the fall of 1918, and then you had a first few months of 1919. The mortalities were seen in young adults and the middle age. So between 15 and 44 years of age, and middle age 45 to 64 saw the highest number of mortalities. And those under 65 actually totaled 99% of the total mortalities. So you'll see the map on your screen about where it affected the United States. And as I mentioned, there will be another presentation later on by Tom DeBlack, who will give more information about the flu. But Central Arkansas was the first and also hardest hit during the epidemic. The mortality rates from the flu in Central Arkansas were the highest in the state. Why was that? Because Little Rock was the largest city in the state. You also had Camp Pike in Pulaski County, in northern Pulaski County, which had about 52,000 people. So you have these population centers. When you have population centers, you're going to have a higher number of people who contract the flu or other diseases. So the mortality rates in Central Arkansas were higher in Central Arkansas, and that was followed by Northwest Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas, of course, you have Fayetteville, you have the University of Arkansas there. So you have these people coming in, possibly bringing the flu into it. The Delta counties in the light pink on your screen saw the lowest mortality rate during this epidemic. That is where the majority of the African Americans lived, and most likely that number is low, as I mentioned earlier, because the deaths were not reported as being from the flu. Now, a lot of people, when you think of diseases, you normally think of insects. You normally think of a bacteria, some sort of virus that causes this disease and how it's transmitted from one person to another. And I want to recommend in her book, The Health of the Country, How American Settlers Understood Themselves and Their Land, historian Connevery Bolton Valencius relates how early settlers considered the environment in selecting new locations. So when you read histories of migrations, when you read these histories of how people moved from one place to another, one of the things that Dr. Valencius does in her book is point out that these people just didn't look at a particular place for manufacturing, for example, how close it was to a city or these other factors, but they also looked at what the environment itself was like, because they considered if they moved into a swampy area, for example, that would inevitably lead to sickness. Free-flowing streams, conversely, would mean that it was a healthy environment. So in her book, she talks about how people selected their locations and they took into consideration the environment and how the environment affected their health and how the environment either made them sick or made them or kept them healthy. And that's especially true in early Arkansas history. Arkansas Post down in southeast Arkansas, established in 1686 at the confluence of the White and Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, just all this water coming into this one point down there, all the bayous down there, the streams, the stagnant water that was down there. So no doubt there were tons of mosquitoes down there. We all know about Arkansas mosquitoes, especially in southeast Arkansas, if you've ever been down in southeast Arkansas in the summer. And so Arkansas Post was just, you had these narratives, these descriptions of Arkansas Post from the 1700s and 1800s about how bad the mosquitoes were down there. And of course, mosquitoes bring disease. They didn't necessarily know that at the time, but it later on, it became more apparent. And Dr. Valencius talks about this in her book, is about how the environment affected people's health, and later advances in science, clearly linked nature to some of the world's deadliest diseases. So like the flu, like the Spanish flu of 1918, yellow fever is a viral infection, but unlike influenza, it is spread through the bites of mosquitoes. And as I mentioned, anyone living in Arkansas knows the bites of these insects. And early Arkansans living in swampy and other damp areas had to contend with the mosquitoes and the possibility of getting sick from their bites. And I like to mention my family. When they immigrated to Arkansas in the late 1880s, they immigrated from Liechtenstein, the small country in Europe, lived near the Rhine River, and they moved to rural Perry County at the confluence of the Fush and Arkansas rivers. If you've ever been in Perry County, in eastern Perry County, it's a really dense, water-filled area, especially where the Fush comes in, empties into the Arkansas. So I like to think of how my family felt when they moved to Arkansas in the late 1880s. And they showed up in December, they settled, and then by summer they were probably wondering what in the world they had gotten themselves into with the mosquitoes and everything going on, and just being so, the climate being so conducive to those mosquitoes. We also have a description of mosquitoes from this book. I have the title page on your screen right now. Heroes and Heroines of Memphis, or Reminiscence of the Yellow Fever Epidemics that affected the city of Memphis. And it talks about those epidemics, 1873, 1878, 1879. The 1878, 79 are the ones that really stand out in the history of Memphis and the yellow fever epidemic. Here the author, Catholic priest, Reverend D.A. Quinn, he wrote this reminiscence. He participated. He was an observer in the fight against yellow fever in Memphis, and so he wrote about his experiences, not only of being in Memphis during that time, but also about his experiences as being a missionary priest in Eastern Arkansas. And he talks about, there's a portion of the book that he talks about the mosquito, and he says, quote, "Perhaps of all the living things around, the mosquito is the most attentive to business here in Eastern Arkansas. Once inside the canopy, or mosquito bar, as it is called in the South, there is but one infallible way of putting an end to his venomous piping, simply to set a match to the mosquito bar. Any other device will only infuriate the little creature that is sure to draw some of your best blood before morning. St. Paul gives a sad recital of his persecutions, shipwrecks, and wonderful escapes, but except the flagellations alone, I would venture to undergo all the others rather than remain one night a helpless victim to a swarm of Arkansas mosquitoes. Even cows, sheep, and horses do not escape their venomous rapacity. You might also see them coming into life as they cover the stagnant waters of the swamps for a distance of 60 miles. So Father Quinn, he obviously had an unpleasant experience with mosquitoes, and how could you ever have a pleasant mosquito or a pleasant experience with mosquitoes? Now, he was also an observer of the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, as I mentioned. Some of the major outbreaks of the 19th century, if you'll remember from that earlier screen that I showed you, was of yellow fever, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. The 1870s saw the yellow fever especially prevalent in the southern states. Of course, they always affected the southern part, but the 1878-79 was a particularly bad epidemic. Early epidemics affected New Orleans. You had Vicksburg, but the one in Memphis was the one that came closest to Arkansas. Now, while Arkansas as a whole pretty much was spared from the outbreak, you did have some outbreaks in the eastern part of the state, in Helena, Forest City, those towns closer to the Mississippi River, and Memphis. But overall, Arkansas itself was spared from the devastation that struck Memphis from yellow fever. Now, officials were worried, though, at the time that the yellow fever would come over from Memphis, and so they mobilized their forces. They tried to do what they could to keep it at bay in Memphis. In 1879, Little Rock was quarantined. There were troops set up to keep people from crossing the Mississippi. And in 1881, the Arkansas Board of Health was created to help fight the yellow fever. Now, that Board of Health, I'll mention, did not stay along for long. It didn't, and it sort of, was disbanded, and it didn't come back until 1913, 5 years before the Spanish flu epidemic. But the city and state officials did what they could to stop this spread of the yellow fever coming over from Memphis. But one of the good things that actually came out of the yellow fever outbreak was the establishment of Little Rock's first permanent hospital. The state had gotten its first permanent hospital a few years earlier in Fort Smith, but the majority of the state did not have any sort of organized hospital, certainly no permanent hospitals. And Little Rock had a very limited health care at the time anyway. But in 1888, the Little Rock's first permanent hospital, as I mentioned, opened its door in the capital city. It was known as Charity Hospital, and it came about because of the Catholic bishop, Edward Fitzgerald, and under the auspices of the Sisters of Charity from Nazareth, Kentucky. The hospital was founded by the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Hager, who made a promise to God in 1878 that if the city of Little Rock was spared from yellow fever, they would provide money to build a hospital in Little Rock. Of course, Little Rock was spared from yellow fever. And so when the Hagers died in the mid-1880s, they kept their promise and they gave money. They left money to the Catholic Diocese of Arkansas. Bishop Edward Fitzgerald contacted the Sisters of Charity in Kentucky. They came over, established Charity Hospital, and today that hospital is still in existence, known as St. Vincent's, CHI, St. Vincent's. So there was some good that came out of the yellow fever epidemic. But St. Vincent was not the only hospital actually established to combat a particular disease. St. Bernard's in Jonesboro was founded in 1900 by the Olivetan Benedictine sisters to treat those afflicted with malaria. Now, malaria was another disease that was prevalent throughout Arkansas, mainly the eastern part of the state. Again, malaria is a mosquito-borne disease. It's caused by a parasite. You get it, you have chills, you have high fever, you have nausea. And even though there was, they had all these patent medicines that came along. You had quinine that helped cure malaria or helped cure some of the symptoms. It wasn't until the late 1880s and early 1900s that a connection was actually made between malaria and mosquitoes. And malaria was a deadly disease. In 1917 alone, there were 2,300 deaths from it in Arkansas. So it wasn't really a disease that that you didn't want to get malaria. And it's interesting to me that Arkansas actually has two connections with that discovery of malaria and mosquitoes. You have Dr. Zaphne Orto up on your right side of your screen. He's in Walnut Ridge in 1882. He studied mosquitoes, and his study of mosquitoes led to other research about malaria and about mosquitoes and how the two were related. You also had Dr. Henry Tebow on your left of your screen. He was from Scott, down just outside of Little Rock. In 1906, he conducted more studies of mosquitoes, and he later became an expert in malaria. And so you have these two Arkansas connections of talking about or discovering these connections between the insect and the disease, which led to obviously more information about the disease and how we can prevent the disease. You had, of course, later on, you had spraying to prevent mosquitoes from breeding, and malaria is pretty much gone in the United States. It's still prevalent in other parts of the country. So we're going to move over to polio. Polio, of course, caused by a virus. It's spread through close contact or contaminated water or food. It started, there was just in the 1920s, there were just these small cases of polio, and it went up and up and up. And then the first really epidemic of polio occurred in the late 1930s. And that's when you reached about 350 cases of the polio. So again, cities tried to mobilize how to combat this, how to prevent it from spreading to others. You had events canceled. Children were prohibited from going to swimming pools, movie theaters, or anything like that. You know, they were told not to congregate because they didn't want the polio to spread. And you had the Army and Navy, the old Army and Navy hospital in Hot Springs that were used to treat victims of polio in the 1940s, 1950s. You know, of course, Hot Springs has always been known for its therapeutic properties. You had people going to Hot Springs all the time, not only for polio in the 1940s, 1950s, but, you know, later on, early on, you had the Native Americans who knew of the curative properties of hot springs. You had people going in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, so forth, to cure arthritis, rheumatism, anything that they, you know, anything that ailed you, you could probably go to Hot Springs and get cured for. So they set up the old Army Navy hospital in Hot Springs to treat people with polio. At one time, now of course the polio, I mentioned just the children for the polio, but it wasn't just children who got polio, adults got it too. So that Army and Navy hospital actually became one of the largest medical facilities in the country that had the largest number of patients dealing with polio. The numbers kept rising. In 1955, of course, the vaccine by Jonas Salk was discovered. But interestingly, a lot of people didn't want to take the vaccine for polio because they thought they didn't know what kind of side effects it might have, or what reactions they might have to it. So there are a lot of people who would have benefited from the vaccine who chose not to take it because of fear. The Arkansas Department of Health at the time tried to allay those fears, tell them there was no reactions. And so that went a long way to ease people's fears. And once the vaccine came out, then the numbers started dropping. And it's pretty much gone by now. You still have some cases of polio, of course, in the 1980s, if you'll remember, 1970s, excuse me. First Lady Betty Bumpers led a immunization campaign to get immunized against polio and other diseases. Tuberculosis, we probably all have heard of the tuberculosis sanatorium in Boonville. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria. The treatment of tuberculosis started in the early part of the 1900s. You had in Arkansas, you had the founding of the Arkansas Tuberculosis Association. And it was across the country, you had these people contracting, tuberculosis. So you had about 160,000 people throughout the United States that would die from tuberculosis. And so how did they treated tuberculosis by isolating people. So the state sanatorium in Boonville was built in the early part of the 1900s. You had where people would go to be treated for tuberculosis. They would be isolated. They had their individual cabins or individual rooms, or where they could be treated and hopefully get enough rest to become stronger and then returned to families. So the one in Boonville, as I mentioned, early 1900s, 1910 is when that was established. But there wasn't one, there was not a sanatorium for African Americans until 1930. So you had this gap between the access to medical care and medical facilities between whites and African Americans. And it wasn't until, as I mentioned, the mid 20th century that you had access for African Americans for the tuberculosis. And even then, the McRae Sanatorium just outside Little Rock in Alexander, it was not up to the same standards as the one in Boonville for white patients. For example, the sanatorium at Boonville had about 700 beds, whereas the sanatorium in Alexander had around 40 beds. So you still had that disparity between medical care for African Americans and medical care for whites. There were still, in the late 1930s, McRae Sanatorium was built. You still had problems with the treatment of tuberculosis. There's still, even after an expansion of both of those sanatoriums, there was still not enough room for the people who had TB, because there were just so many people who had it. And then they didn't have the proper equipment to actually diagnose people with TB. X-rays were not readily available for people to be diagnosed. So in the 1940s, more information, more research was done on tuberculosis. You could better treat the disease, you could better detect it. So that all increased the possibility or the improvement of people surviving tuberculosis and living a healthier and more productive lives. Medicine came out, it helped, and so the tuberculosis sanatorium actually shut down in 1973 because such strides had been made in the treatment of tuberculosis that they didn't need to isolate people anymore to the degree that they had been. But with the drugs, they were able to treat these people and as I said, have them live productive lives. Now, of course, diseases are not, there are other diseases besides ones that are transmitted by insects and other ways. Of course, there's also sexually transmitted diseases. In Hot Springs, the United States Public Health Service opened up a VD clinic to treat people with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. It was originally built in the early 1900s. They had a bathhouse with it, the clinic, and the thing that precipitated this clinic is they noticed that when they looked at the World War I roles, these people who had been drafted into World War I during World War I turned out that there was a huge number of people with sexually transmitted diseases. And so the Public Health Service, the government, decided to build this clinic in Hot Springs to treat people with syphilis and other diseases. There was the treatment of the use of mercury and other things, other medicines that came along just from the research at the Hot Springs facility. So that one was led by Dr. O.C. Winger, Oliver C. Winger, and it's just this whole clinic at Hot Springs is it's fascinating to me because just the way the hot springs, the history of hot springs, would you expect any other city in the state to have a VD clinic other than Hot Springs because of the reputation of Hot Springs with the gambling and the mobsters and the baths and everything that goes on there? It's just interesting to me that Hot Springs would have a VD clinic like this. And of course, when you get these diseases, not only do you have the legitimate science that goes along with these diseases and how to cure them and how to take care of the symptoms and everything, but you also have at the same time, especially with the Spanish flu and in the early 1900s, you had this plethora of patent medicines, these quack medicines that were promoted to prevent basically anything that you could think of, influenza, malaria, anything. You had things like Humphreys 7-7 and Mint Alba that were touted as being able to cure coughs, colds, influenza, cold in the head, sore throat, tonsillitis. And then you had smokeless, tobaccoless cigarettes, which supposedly cured the flu. And then you had Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic, which was there to basically help with the flu or anything else that you came along with. These were national medicines, but Arkansas had its share of patent medicine companies too. In Little Rock, you had Bond's Pharmacy Company, longtime pharmacy, who made their own patent medicines that could cure headache, neuralgia, malaria, constipation, indigestion. And then you had Lopez Remedy Company in Hot Springs that would cure blood poison, rheumatism, malaria, etc. So you had this whole line of quack medicines that were promoted, as I mentioned, to basically cure everything that ailed you. So it wasn't, people had not only to deal with the symptoms and these actual diseases, but they had their hopes. They were given these patent medicines, or they placed their hopes in these patent medicines that often did nothing or even made them sicker. Now, of course, all these diseases, they would not have been, Arkansas would not be as far along in our fight against the diseases if it wasn't for the hospitals in the state, especially with the establishment of the medical department, the medical school at the University of Arkansas in 1879. And that came about as it was an interesting aspect in medical history, because the medical department, it was founded by eight doctors went in to create this medical department of the Arkansas Industrial University. It was not officially affiliated with the university at the time. The university gave permission for it to use its name, and that was the extent of the collaboration between the university and the medical school. Eventually, of course, the medical department, when its life was put into question in 1911 because of the poor education, that's the time that it became officially associated with the University of Arkansas. But where we are now, and with UAMS being on the front line of the COVID-19 pandemic today, we would not be as far along in our health fight had it not been for the establishment of the medical department at Arkansas Industrial University. What you have on your screen is the first site of the medical school in 1879, the Sperandillo Restaurant in Little Rock. Of course, it's now on Markham University, or Markham Street near University Avenue. different, you go from this one building to this multi-building campus. And I'm going to end it there. And I think that if we have time for some questions, I'll be happy to answer some questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Guy now.
Okay, believe I'm back. Before we get to the Q&A, as Tim mentioned at the beginning of this, this is part of a larger series called Monday Maladies that will be running every other Monday. And many of the things Tim talked about will be featured in greater detail in some of these upcoming lectures. For example, on June 22nd, Tom DeBlack will be talking about the 1918 influenza epidemic and its legacy in Arkansas. On July 6th, David Sesser will be talking about disease in Civil War Arkansas. On July 22nd, William Lindsay will be talking about a new book he co-wrote with two other authors that traces the history of medical practice through 3 generations, some of which occurs in Arkansas. On August 3rd, Blake Perkins will be talking about efforts to eradicate tick fever and resistance to those efforts in Arkansas. On August 17, Janice Percival will be talking about Hot Springs, Arkansas, and its role in the national healthcare community. And on August 31st, Rachel Patton will be talking about the Arkansas Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Now let's go to questions. The first question, Tim, is, do you know if there are any memorials to those who died during the pandemic of 1918? And I wonder if you could talk some about the cenotaph for the Puerto Rican workers.
As far as I know, there is not a memorial for the 1918 flu epidemic, or pandemic, as we're now calling it. If there is one, I'm not aware of it. So if someone please correct me if I'm wrong. And the Puerto Rican workers, you're asking me to call on my memory here.
Well, maybe I can help you for the.
Was that the
picric acid
plant? Yes, that's what I was going to say. But you go ahead and explain that, because.
Okay. Well, there was a picric acid plant in the works in just outside of Little Rock, I think it was at the time, developing picric acid, which was used in ammunition and explosives during World War I. And since all the men had left to go to war, they brought in a lot of Puerto Rican workers who arrived at the time that the flu was raging, and also they arrived in winter and they were poorly clothed, and so there was a lot of casualties there. But that's the only marker I know that is even related to flu deaths, I think. I mean, you don't know of any others? Or
no, I don't know of any others. You know, there are, of course, the individual markers of throughout cemeteries through Arkansas, but nothing as a memorial as the whole for people who died. And I don't know if I mentioned during my talk, but I should have if I didn't mention it, that there were about 7,000 Arkansans who died in the 1918 flu pandemic. Of course, that number might be higher, but as far as I know, no, there is no memorial for those who died from the 1918 flu.
The next question was, West Memphis, Arkansas, in existence during the yellow fever outbreak of 1878-79?
No.
Right, that it would have been Hopefield at that point.
Right. And there were cases of yellow fever in Hopefield. Of course, that would have been just right across the Mississippi River from Memphis.
Yeah, I don't think West Memphis, it wasn't laid out until the 1880s, and didn't really start growing until, after that.
Right.
Someone else asked, do you know where the George House, the first hospital, was located in Little Rock?
I don't know the exact, I don't have the exact address off the top of my head, but it was downtown Little Rock it's in East Little Rock towards about where, in the area where I'm drawing a blank, not as far as the Clinton Library, but somewhere around about 3rd and what is that? Further than, it's east of Rock, whatever those streets are across, further east. I can't remember what those Commerce and Sherman, right, somewhere around over in there.
Okay.
In that area.
Okay. Why was the polio vaccine given in sugar cubes?
Just to make it more palatable.
Why don't they give all vaccines in sugar cubes?
I don't know. Back in those patent medicines that I mentioned, a lot of them they look like candies, and that so people found it more, or it had a more pleasing taste and look to take it, but it was just purely. It's like when they put cherry flavoring in cough syrup.
Okay. Do you know if there were any bad outcomes for those who got the polio vaccine?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I have not. In the research that I did for this presentation, I didn't come across anything with bad outcomes for it. But again, if someone knows about it, I'm glad to. I'll be happy to learn about it if someone knows something about it.
Someone asked, just curious, are you collecting any of the current quack medicine ads, etc., that purport to cure COVID-19? History in the making.
Yes, we are. And I know you mentioned this at the beginning about the Butler Center collecting stuff collecting materials from the COVID-19. We are also collecting materials from COVID-19.
Okay.
So, whatever, if anyone, the people who are listening, whoever you decide to give it to, please pick up materials and donate it to some archives, because 30, 40, 50 years from now, people are going to be interested in how we dealt and how we reacted to this pandemic. So the collection of materials is very important.
Are you collecting any of the actual quack medicines, the colloidal silver and?
If we come across them, yes, we are. We do collect those, and we do have some of the earlier quack medicines in the original bottles and the original medicine. But
wow.
Yeah, but we do collect the actual artifacts and the actual medicine in quotes, I should say.
So some of those are probably expired, huh?
Yes, and some of them you would not want to take them. You probably didn't want to take them to begin with, but you certainly don't want to take them 7,500 years after the fact.
Okay. Looks like the last one, not a question, but more a comment. This isn't specific to Arkansas, but 538 is doing a really informative podcast called Podcast 19. That's pretty interesting.
I'll have to check that out.
But that looks to be it, unless anyone has any last minute question. If not, Tim, we thank you.
I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to write my email in the chat box, so if people want my email, and if you have any questions that you think of later on, feel free to email me, or if you have any comments or anything about my presentation, just feel free to email me.
Is the Historical Research Center currently open?
We are not currently open to visitors. If you already work at UAMS, you can come in, but right now we're not open to the public, unfortunately.
But they could email you with any research questions and follow up later.
Right, exactly. And if anyone, when we are reopened to the public, if anyone would like to come by and get a tour, we'd be happy to give you a tour of the place. And I just touched briefly on some of the things that we collect, but we collect the whole gamut of medical history, and I'm always glad to give a tour of the facility and show you some of the artifacts that we have. I'm always glad to show off our scrapbook of intestines too. So.
Well, okay, we thank you. And again, to everyone watching this, do check out some of our forthcoming programs that will go into more detail into the history of medicine and pandemic in Arkansas. Stay safe out there, wear your mask, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands.
Yes. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you, Tim.